A huge thank you to everyone that became a paying Patreon supporter in the last week and to everyone that upgraded their Patreon subscription. Every penny that you give goes towards making the podcast every single week. A few hundred people make this possible, and it really is a team effort. This week's show is a good reminder of how powerful interest can hijack the news agenda. The loudest voices with the deepest pockets have set the framing for the facts get a look in. Over the Top, Under the Radar exists to slow all of that down. Take a deeper look at the big stories, the ones being overlooked, and give you the context you need to make up your mind. We are Patreon supported proudly, which means that we answer to you and nobody else. No advertisers, no platform deciding what we're allowed to say, and no billionaires. And here's the part I really want you to hear. Your support is the reason the show exists at all. Every supporter is a small, concrete voice for media that nobody owns. If it matters to you, you can be part of keeping it going. Patreon.com/overthetop under the radar. Hi, I'm Carys.
And I'm Aditya Chakrabortty.
We are on a mission to make sense of the news and understand why the media obsesses over some stories, completely ignores others, and how much money do you have to be wealthy? This is Over the Top, Under the Radar. I'm so excited to be joined by Aditya Chakrabortty, who is an MBE, a Guardian,
Carys.
a Guardian columnist, economics expert, all-round good human. And thank you for coming on the show.
It's a pleasure.
So we're going to talk about tax today. We've got a special because it's a summer holiday. We're losing the normal format. We're getting these nice in-depth August episodes. And I wanted you to come on the show. And thank you so much for agreeing to do it. Talk about tax and maybe have a bit of a beef, maybe a bit of a disagreement. I think we're going to. And so, well, for the context for people is in November 2025, so sort of 9 months ago now, cast your minds back. Keir Starmer's still the Prime Minister. Rachel Reeves is the Chancellor. We're in the run-up to her second budget. And you wrote a column in The Guardian. I obviously religiously read your columns, as I'm sure many people listening do, about a wealth tax.
Right.
Where you said, everyone on the left wants a wealth tax, and it's not a good idea. I mean, that maybe I'm paraphrasing the headline. And I remember reading that. What on earth? And I've sort of wanted you on the show ever since.
This festering resentment.
Yeah, I wouldn't say resentment, but I was just like, why are you doing this?
Right.
We might not even get the wealth tax.
Right.
Why are you like a respected, economically literate commentator?
Right.
Like breaking ranks with the left. But it was, as with many of your columns, it was like very well thought through and reasoned. But I thought we could come on and talk about it because there is a like growing consensus on the left, or pretty established consensus on the left, by which I mean Green Party, left of the Labour Party, you know, people around Burnham, TUC, Gary Stevenson, tax justice campaigners, that like the thing we need to do, and I think, you know, the point you've made, which I agree with, is like almost like the thing we need to do to fix everything is put a 1 or 2% tax on wealth. We can talk about the mechanisms, and that will solve many of the problems. That will be fair, that will raise billions of pounds, and it will help everything. And your position was, no, it won't.
My position is basically a wealth tax doesn't go far enough if you want to do all those things. You're treating it like a Swiss Army knife. It's more of a toothpick for all the good it does. And I genuinely don't understand, Carys, why people on the left have allowed themselves to be so captured by this one idea of a tax on wealth. It's as if there are no other taxes on wealth, so it's ill-informed, because we do have inheritance tax, we do have something called a capital gains tax, which is the return on your assets, properties,
stocks and shares, your
stocks,
property,
fine art, wine, I don't know what, go wild, Carys, whatever
gold.
You've got. Exactly.
Okay.
And with even council tax, if you scrunch up your eyes, is a bit of a tax on wealth. So we do have some of these things around, and I was puzzled by it. But if you want me to run through my objections, it's basically this. A wealth tax, it will raise tons and tons of money. No, it won't. If you take Zach Plansky's proposal, the Green Party say that their wealth tax will raise something like £15 billion a year. Which, you know, if I found it down the back of this chair, I'd be delighted, right? I'd go home a happy man. However, that's just over 1% of what the British government spends in a year. So it doesn't raise tons of money. The second thing, it will do a lot about the billionaires. That's what you hear. It will rein in billionaires. And it's as if Britain is America, and we have guys like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and all of this crew roaming around Britain. We don't.
We've got a few billionaires, though.
We do,
we're
but
not
actually,
without
Britain
billionaires.
has got fewer billionaires than the state of California alone, right? Britain is, I would certainly agree with you, Carys, really unequal, and it's also rich. But doing some out inequality requires more than just raising or levying one tax, right? If we think, and here's where I do agree with the campaigners on this, if we think that billionaires have got too much of a say in our politics, that wealth has been allowed to trump work and the value of work in our country, then what you need to do about that goes way beyond taxes, right? You would be thinking about stronger rights for workers. You'd also be thinking about keeping billionaires out of politics as far as you can, really restricting the role that money plays in politics and in the media. It is really amazing. It honestly spangles my mind that the Green Party barely talks about these other things when these are clearly all things that they ought to be calling for. I would really welcome Zach Plancy coming out and saying, I am leader of the anti-billionaires party, and I'm my party.
Come on, he does sort of say that.
Where's all the rest of the policies that go with that, right?
I would agree with that. I think especially on political donations and money in politics, it seems bananas to me given how much money is coming into Reform UK from such a range of sketchy sources, you would think it'd be top of the list. Like Labour have tried to restrict donations from non-doms. Channel 4 have investigated that Christopher Harbin's got a way to get around that by sort of registering to vote but not moving his assets. So it does feel like a gaping hole. The money in politics, rich people in politics.
Just there.
Yeah.
It's not a gaping hole. You know what's happened there?
What?
And this is actually disclosed in the book that Patrick Maguire and Gabriel Pogrund wrote about Keir Starmer. Angela Rayner was going to announce a massive clampdown on rich people's donations to political parties, and was stopped by, they claim, Morgan McSweeney, because Lord Arley wouldn't wear it. Because let's not forget, they had their own, they had their own sugar daddies who were bankrolling them, right? And they used to boast about how much money they were making from companies and private donors, and they didn't need unions anymore. So it's not a gaping hole; it's been an intentionally created hole by party after party
because they need the rich people's money. Yeah, I mean but the Green Party don't have that excuse. No. Where I think I disagree with you is. Why didn't you just yes and? Because you're not saying wealth taxes are bad. You're saying there's a whole ton of things we need to do to address inequality. I hear you're saying that you think this wealth tax wouldn't work, but isn't it important to send a signal? Isn't there a political value in the wealth tax in terms of we do have things like capital gains tax? I think inheritance tax is a bit different because it's taxing the transfer of wealth as opposed to wealth that people are holding. I agree that the left hasn't done enough thinking about tax, but I guess the point of this wealth tax that's like people who've got more than £10 million is to try and recognise there are a category of people who have too much money and the state is entitled to some of that money. Listen to the podcast you did with The Guardian, which I'm sure others have, the latest, where you talked about this one-off wealth tax being a better alternative, this kind of smash and grab raid on a bigger set of people with a larger range of incomes, people with maybe £2 million of wealth. What have you got against just an annual thing for the people on 10 million or more?
Okay, so first off, I have been consistent throughout, whether it's in that podcast or in that column that you kindly referenced at the beginning, in saying I've got nothing against it, against the wealth tax per se. Fine. Yeah. I'm just saying it's not going to do all the things that it's been loaded on it, right? So the biggest and most comprehensive work on wealth taxes was published in the COVID pandemic period by a bunch of academics, which drew upon dozens and dozens and dozens of studies looking into what a wealth tax could do, the best way of levying it, and so on. And their firm proposal was that you don't do an annual wealth tax because, after all, people with wealth also have lawyers and accountants and ways of trying to dodge an annual tax. If they know an annual bill is coming round, they'll start thinking about ways to dodge that. So what they suggested instead was you just do a one-off raid at midnight the tax
In the dark
tax
of
man
night,
and woman,
you're outside the banks.
they go, right, okay, we are levying a bunch of tax on your assets. And they said, actually, rather than make it assets over 10 million, which is, you're quite right, is a Zach Plansky's position, assets over £1 million. That would raise £250 billion, which is a hell of a lot more than the kind of sums you're talking, right?
We like to hear it, and it's quicker.
And the crucial thing about it is it's basically a windfall tax on wealth, right? It just happens once, and no one ever speaks of it again. We all forget about it afterwards the next day and go about our business. And that money can go into that would be transformative, actually, some amount of money like that. Now, the threshold is important here, and this is probably my biggest beef with the campaigners for a wealth tax is to raise serious amounts of money, you have to drop the threshold a long way. People who have got £1 million of assets in this country would include couples who own homes in inner London. Yeah. Perhaps. They would include a lot of people who wouldn't necessarily think of themselves as being wealthy. They would certainly include people who might be tempted to vote for Zach Plansky. You can imagine why there's a very good reason why Zach Plansky would not want to levy a wealth tax on his own voters, okay?
Yes.
On the other hand, what you get from the campaigners for this wealth tax, this agreement that you've set the threshold really, really high, £10 million, is basically it's a tax that they are implying will never affect any ordinary person. It's something that only goes on those people over there. They're the problem. And Carys, that's where I have the biggest issue with all this stuff, right? The problems in this country are huge, right? We're a low-growing economy with very high levels of debt, and many people in this country have really they're really struggling to meet the cost of living to an extent which in the past 5 years means that middle class people now feel poor, and poor people are completely wiped out or underwater, right? These are huge issues. To say, oh, well, what we do is we tax billionaires makes an absolute travesty of the deep hole this country is in, right? I would say, and this is probably the thing that would probably annoy someone like you, I would say it's dishonest, because it's as dishonest as saying stop the boats is the solution to this country's problems, right? It's simple, it's catchy, and in the end, it doesn't even touch the sides of the problems it is talking about, right? Just in the same way that when we were talking earlier about the things that you might do to tackle inequality, you know who proposed all those things? Not Zach Plansky, not Jeremy Corbyn, Ed Miliband. So left-wing politics in this country is now more conservative than it was 12 years ago, because Ed Miliband took his party into 2015 election. This to me is a remarkable state of affairs.
It's interesting you say that, because there's a bit of that I really agree with and a bit of that I really disagree with. We've seen this huge rightward shift in our politics because of really rich people that buy and control the media. And I think the tax is trying to speak to a truth which people feel and have an emotional reaction to, which is there is a category of people that is like floating above the rest of us, like flying in private jets, like jetting around in yachts, buying up and thinking of Paul Marshall, who, you know, bought up The Spectator and, you know, buying up media things. And like, sure, we don't have as many Elon Musks as America, but there's still the Murdochs, there's still the Paul Marshalls, there's still the Christopher Harborns. So like, our politics has been skewed by really rich people. They're not entirely responsible for the rightward shift, but they are definitely supporting it and backing it and funding it. And I think there is another story to be told, which is there is this tier of people and companies who have been making out like bandits while our living standards have stagnated. And like, I think the attempt to try and draw that line and say there's a category of people who like no consequences seem to apply to and they don't seem to pay tax. Like, I think that is trying to speak to something real in a story that does need to be told, which is like, we're not all in it together, struggling along. And the person with the £1 million house, like, yeah, they're doing a lot better than my mum who's still in social housing, but they're not on the same level as someone who can fly by private jet, as someone who can hire a lawyer or an accountant to like get out of something. And I think this is about trying to tell a story about that and say, we don't like that. We don't want a country like that.
I understand that. You tell a really good story. And if I were to respond to it, I'll start with the simple bits first. the answer to Murdoch's grip on the tabloids and the press is to have better press regulation and probably to have a much stricter regime on press ownership, which is something that we sold the pass on 40 years ago when he was allowed to extend his empire, right? The answer to Chris Harborne's £5 million bung to Nigel Farage, well, it may be that Farage is caught out by the laws around party donations. However, you and I agree we should be tightening up party donations and party funding, right? So that politicians work to us, the voters, rather than to their rich funders. And so the idea that we live in a society where there are billionaires floating around us and they're all having it away, that's true at a global level, but it's not true of the country that we're in. Those guys don't live here. They're not based here, right? The other thing that I would say about your story, and take this from someone who grew up in a factory suburb of London, is that the story you can tell is not so far from the story that Andy Byrne has been telling about this country, which is we've gone through decades in which a lot of people have just been thrown on the rubbish dump, on the rubbish heap, right? We went through deindustrialization. So the factories in my own suburb all went out like lights but over the 80s and 90s. I remember them going. We went through austerity, which really took chunks out of people who relied upon public services and on social security and on women as well. We've gone through wave after wave of privatizations. We were more enthusiastic about privatization than any other comparable country, and we went for outsourcing. And then we had Brexit 10 years ago. So there's been a long-running series of forces which have done a lot to make people in this country feel that they are not full citizens of this country and they don't have the same economic, political rights and social rights as other people. Very little of that has got something to do with billionaires. Politicians created the billionaires. Billionaires did not create the politicians, right? In that mess where politicians do not regulate things like press ownership, do not regulate party funding, do not regulate working environments properly, so that we've rolled back our level of working rights in this country back decades in the course of my own lifetime, we then end up with this mess of a country which does not resemble America at all. America's problem is that it is a very high growth economy. Trump is running very hot, and most of the benefits of that growth are being arrogated by a bunch of men. A small bunch of men. These are the guys who are taking all the money. That is not our city. We're a very low growth, low productivity entrepot at which rich people from around the world come through, buy an assets, take a shoebox, put their money away. But actually, for most of the people in places like the suburb of London, which I grew up, that's supposedly this golden city. They don't get to participate in any of that. The story of billionaires are mugging us all off and having a laugh and they cause this mess, I'd say that's not just simplistic, that's wrong in this case. Politicians created the mess. Politicians allowed billionaires this amount of power. Politicians need to work out how to take power back, and we need to force them to do that. And a wealth tax will do hardly any of that.
You've made a really good point, and you're right that the deregulation, so much of the 80s, we could just wang on about Thatcher. I will resist the urge to do that. The problem is that a political story has to be true and has to touch on something true, but it has to feel true and it has to connect with people's understanding. And I guess there is a grain of truth that whilst we have been getting poorer, whilst politicians sold off the family silver, I'm very obsessed with water companies. People who listen to the show know. I guess the bit that I think that I'm contesting is, maybe it's not all down to billionaires or rich people. Maybe it's not
important
all down to
advance for Chakrabortty there.
But a lot of people have got rich while we have stagnated or got poorer. Also Jeff Bezos has paid very little tax. Jeff Bezos and his Amazon subsidiaries
totally agree with that.
has got rich from the UK.
Yeah.
Apple, Apple
and again,
sells a ton of iPhones here and they don't pay tax.
A Labour government in Wales built a road for Amazon, called it the Amazon Road, using taxpayer money so that they could have a road going into one of their distribution warehouses. Again, Labour are fully complicit with this. It's not
Labour
hard
are complicit,
anything, right?
Politicians are complicit, and the people who have profited or got rich whilst our living standards have stagnated or declined, they are also complicit. Maybe they didn't create the world they live in. They definitely lobby to maintain it.
All right, 2 points to that. One, if you just make it about a wealth tax and you say that it's down to billionaires, you're effectively stripping people of their own agency, because a wealth tax is eventually relies on a government set to enact it and then to levy it, right? And you're saying to people, actually, what you need to do is just wait on the government to do something and maybe pressure the government. The second thing I would say, and this is a rule I was taught by a very beloved colleague of mine at The Guardian, who's now retired, Martin Kettle, who said, always be careful when you use the word we. You said, we are not getting better off, they are getting better off. Be really careful about that. It is absolutely true that the value of your work, in terms of how it's got paid, may have fallen or be in real terms flat compared to where it was 20 years ago. And it's also true that if you worked in one of the lower paid parts of the workforce, your living standards were in decline even under Tony Blair, so before the banking crash. However, as pretty much everyone who lives in or knows London knows also this truth, which is you could stay at home and not go out to work and stay in your own occupied home in London if you're lucky enough to have one, and your home will be earning more in value than you would have done had you gone out to work, right? This is true of a lot of people.
A lot of people,
right?
yeah.
That if they own their own home in London, that they don't need to go out to work, they can just stay at home. And certainly for 20 years, it was the case that the value of your house is appreciated sufficiently that you didn't need to go out to work.
But if you're living in the house, you don't necessarily see that value, right?
No, you have to sell it. Right?
You have to sell it, you have to move to see the value. Or you have to be a private landlord, in which case, yes, that does really have a big impact.
But it makes the point, Carys, that what we've done is as the country has learnt that owning wealth of some kind means that you're better off than just relying upon the fruits of your own labour. I could take you along the road in which I grew up, and landlordism was almost unknown when I was growing up, right? 40% of it is now landlorded. And I looked at the register of the owners, which was provided for me by my friends at Better Homes Enfield, fantastic campaigning group based in Enfield. And you see the names and you see the addresses of the owners. They're not living in Mayfair or Kensington. They're people called Bilal or Victoria. And you can tell from their names that they're from all over His Majesty's Commonwealth. And they live nearby. I would presume they've decided to buy these houses because the value of their work does not pay them enough. And they think, okay, well, I'm not getting paid that much at work. What do I do to provide for myself in my retirement? I better go and buy myself a buy-to-let. That's where this is. But
how do we change that incentive?
I love that you immediately went to that, right? I love that you went to that because you just made my point for me. I completely agree with you.
Okay.
So right? You want to tax landlords more?
Great.
But you're not taxing billionaires at that point. There are something like 3 million amateur landlords in this country. I would remind you that at one point, very recently, the biggest landlords in this country were a pair of retired teachers from Kent. Yes. And the story of a road like my road is a story of people who think, okay, I can't afford to do a buy-to-let in somewhere more desirable, but I will go to Zone 4 or Zone 5 of Outer London and I'll buy somewhere there and I'll rent it out to some other poor sod. Maybe turn it into a house of multiple occupation.
Okay, you're right. Not a billionaire problem.
A problem of an asset economy, which is different. So we can
agree to taxes on private landlords?
So we do have taxes on private landlords.
But we need to increase them. We have to disincentivise them more.
Well, what I'd really love to see is I'd love to see much more public house building, which effectively put private landlords, especially at the bottom end of the market, under serious pressure and force them to shut up shop entirely.
House building and also maybe compulsory purchase of things, because we do have housing stock. It does happen, but when
that does happen, and I don't disagree with you. But again, we're not talking primarily about tax problems there, right? We're talking about doing something different.
How would you feel about us talking about taxing millionaires and billionaires?
Fine.
We're not given it's not just the
because
billionaires.
at least that's closer to the truth of the situation.
Okay, well that's a good compromise. The thing I'd love to talk about that I really do agree with you on though is I think there is rhetorical and political value in creating a group of people that aren't us, and you're right, I have to be careful about who the we is, and saying they are to blame for a lot of our problems. I do think there's something that's lost when we say that there is a magical tax that a group of people that aren't us have to pay and then everything gets better. Just like if we can stop the boats and stop all these people coming in, then you'll be able to get a council house, which isn't true, but a lot of people feel is true. And I do think the thing that is lost is that tax should be a collective endeavour that we all feel good about participating in. Well, yeah,
Speak for
maybe
yourself
not, but
there.
like I think that there's if we just say, and also that I think a lot about New Labour more than I wish to. And one of the things I think about was Gordon Brown's penny on the pound for the NHS.
Yeah.
And that sometimes if you do it right, people can all, and the NHS is something we're all incredibly proud of, even though it's not as good as it used to be.
Yeah.
And that sense of, yeah, penny on the pound for the NHS, I'm happy to pay that. I'm not delighted to pay that, like if I had a choice between paying it or not. And I guess I think that if the conversation about tax becomes about soak these billionaires, do this one wealth tax that will raise all the money we need, which isn't true, then we lose the chance to say we all pay tax so that we all have schools and hospitals and roads.
Right.
And so I think that is something that is lost from the kind of narrow focus on the wealth tax, and something that we need for social cohesion, and that middle class people and working class people should feel proud about paying tax. Maybe proud is too ambitious, but I think that is something that
They should feel like they're part of this country, right?
Yeah.
And obviously, tax is part of what you pay for being part of this country. If you're lucky enough to earn enough to pay tax, and that's what you pay. I just want to return to your point, which is, I think, one of the points in which we diverge is on the need for simple narratives. And you say people do need villains. And
heroes and villains.
And I think that is a misreading the success of reform. I do think that is, you're quite right, that is driving the wealth tax campaign. My argument with it is that it's become a substitute for all forms of politics on the left. That's where I really diverge. However, the idea that there should be heroes and villains is a misreading, I think, of success of reform. Reform stepped into a vacuum in politics because the Labour Party basically gave up on working class votes and left a whole bunch of working class areas of Britain to die effectively. Now, the people who are turning out to vote for reform may not be those voters, or they may be those voters from some way further on down the line, pensioners. They're not the future of this country, those reform voters. And I think it's a mistake to think that the future of this country is being won by really simple slogans. So what you're saying reminds me of something I once actually tried very hard to find the answer to. Before the banking crash really, really hit, 2007, that Christmas, Northern Rock had collapsed. And I was wondering, when is there going to be a revolt against the super rich in this country? And I rang round a bunch of people who'd spent a lot of their time thinking about the super rich. One unambiguous answer came back to me. If members of the public thought that very rich people had done something to earn their wealth, they were actually fairly relaxed about letting them get on with it. Now, Elon Musk is, I'm sure, a remarkable engineer, thinks very far into the future. He's also a complete subsidy junkie and took a lot of his money off the US government, right?
Yeah.
Sam Altman has tried very hard to remain on the right side of the White House for a reason. Mark Zuckerberg entirely relies upon political connections for the value of Meta, right? But it's a mistake to think that the term super rich, billionaire necessarily carries a cloud with it in lots of people's minds, because some people look at that and think, you know what, I want a bit of that as well.
Yeah, although I think that is a pretty significant difference between the UK and the US, where they're generally public attitudes tend to be, well, anyone could become a millionaire or billionaire and I might make it, is more the American attitude of like, well, I might be rich, I might achieve the American dream, so I don't want taxes on rich people. And I don't think we should demonize all rich people or billionaires, just like
you've let me
reform.
down.
Well, I mean, I do in a sense.
I
don't think you're a billionaire and you made your money morally. I think it's easier to
right.
Like
and now,
there are extremes, right? You can
now
look at
we're on
Roman Polanski and be like,
something.
you literally
Right.
scammed people out of their money to get rich.
Now we're on something. If you want to say billionaires are policy failures, I'm with you. If you want to say
and
there should be a
they're
limit
immoral.
beyond
They're
which people
immoral.
should, fine. But
You
then
don't need that
say
much
that.
money.
Don't piddle about with a wealth tax. Say there should be a limit on how much people have.
Which lots of people support, majority of people support.
But I noticed that the wealth tax movement has not moved into that territory, which would be good. Would be good, right?
And to be fair, I'm not caping for the wealth tax movement or the Green Party. I don't see a way we can tell a progressive story about the UK that doesn't point the finger at some people that are misbehaving.
Yeah, point them at Westminster.
Westminster, but also companies and rich people. Like, we have to point the
Who
finger at,
allows
like,
them to get away with it?
Sports
Who gives them
Direct.
the money?
Yeah, but
Sports
increasingly,
Direct. Who gave them the subsidies?
100%. But like, are
Sports
those
Direct-
people
Sports Direct-
not responsible?
Sports
Is Mike
Direct's
Astley, like, is he
biggest
not
warehouse
responsible?
is in Shirebrook, right? The Labour council that ran that place boasted at the time they sold it to Sports Direct, this will create more jobs than the coal mine ever did. And look at the jobs they created there.
But can we
Politicians
really say
created
it's only
this.
politicians' fault? And
It's
these
not only
companies they're not
it's not
complicit
only
at all.
politics'
Also, they
fault.
lobby for all
But
this
once
stuff. Do
you
you
take
think
the
that, like, Sports Direct are just they're just sitting behind their desk and the council called and they were like, hey, guess what? We'd love to, or Amazon, they were like, hey, Amazon, would you like us to build you a road? Like, they're lobbying for this stuff.
For the benefit of your viewers, Carys, I just want to remind you, the very first time we ever met, you said two things to me. You said, I am hungry, I am angry, I am hangry. At that point, Carys, I knew I'd have to do whatever whatever you told me to. So I love this argument because it reminds me of the good old days when we used to really chop it up. But I would say that you're right to say, look, the company shouldn't be avoiding tax. But as soon as you start talking about all of this stuff, I notice that you then start to use much of the same, rather more complex and subtle arguments that I've been urging people do, right?
But people we're living, for better or worse, we're living in the era of TikTok and like sound bites and lots of endlessly short, clippable, scrollable videos. People don't have the attention span to hear about the Big Bang and everything that Thatcher did. Most people aren't spending all their time thinking about politics and the economy.
I'm a journalist. I believe in communicating things as simply as possible, but I don't agree with making them up.
But it's not made up to say that
it's all billionaires' fault is making up.
A lot of it's their fault. I imagine about a lot of it's their fault. And companies. Like, do you think any of these companies
are you so
are
reluctant to point the finger at SW1, which is where a lot of this stuff began?
I feel fine to point the finger at politicians, but how much power do they even have now? Especially with local authorities that have been like hollowed out, have no money, and like very little expertise.
Why are we talking? You've just been talking about media ownership and the way that the media has actually shortened and distorted politics. We have a culture secretary who could do something about media ownership and media regulation in this country. I notice Lisa Nandy's not shown much of an appetite for doing any of this stuff.
Yeah,
so,
and just like we shouldn't have Palantir in the NHS, that is 100% the government's fault. But like, I think that, so we have had her on the show before and she's a friend. Faiz Shaheen was a Labour candidate standing in Chingford, so I know quite a lot.
Disgracefully,
yeah, treated appallingly. In the run-up to when we thought she would be standing as a Labour candidate, we ran some focus groups in Chingford to see what people thought of her, what people thought of Ian Duncan Smith. There was a group of young parents, so people who had kids still in the home who lived in Chingford. Lots of them were landlords, interestingly. Very Chingford thing. And we showed them a video of Pfizer and they all loved her. They warmed to her that she's like us. It'd be great if someone like that was an MP. They liked what she was saying. They thought she was a good thing. They were like, but how much difference can she make? And I think that we can blame politicians, we can hold them to account, we can say they're not doing enough, they don't act in our interest. And if you look at the world that we live in, do you really think MPs have the same amount of power they did 50 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago?
That comment that you paraphrase from Chingford, from your focus group in Chingford, how much difference can she make, speaks, in my mind, to a sense in which politicians have got used to acting small, right? It's not that that politics has got smaller, it's that politicians have got smaller and what they feel they can do has got smaller. Never forget that corporations get their limited liability from the rest of us, right? That protects them. That companies work in spaces that are granted them because of us. They sell to us often, they sell to the state, they employ us, right? They are here by our permission. If politicians don't feel the need to exercise regulatory power, further political power, if they don't feel the need to constrain them, that is politicians' fault. And in fact, one of the arguments that I've been making to you over the course of our conversation is that politicians not only have run away from their responsibilities to curtail and to restrain and to ensure that companies do act in public interest, they've actually actively handed money over to companies that do not act in the public interest on the illusory promise of a few extra jobs. What I'm really calling for, I don't think you would really disagree with me, Carys, is I'm really asking for a return to politics in a much more rounded sense where we realise that actually we have a lot more agency and politicians have a lot more agency, especially in a country that is one of the richest societies in human history, that remains one of the most powerful countries on the planet, that often sets the standards that other countries follow on how corporations are treated, on a whole range of aspects of governance. And I don't think that's controversial.
No, I don't think it is at all. And I completely agree with that. I think one of the hopefully exciting things about Andy Burnham coming in is that the rhetoric is at least that he thinks that government can do more than it's been doing. He talks about, tackling 40 years of neoliberalism. We'll see if he can. And I think there is already, at least in the rhetoric, a shift in the ambition of what government can do. And I completely agree that politicians haven't done enough and could do more. I think that, and maybe this comes back to the tax justice campaigners, there isn't a ton of energy and dynamism in Westminster and in the people that work in Westminster. And some of it is because, people think small, maybe they're lazy, maybe they're, a bit captured by all of their colleagues that now work at Uber that used to work in Westminster with them. And, they're telling them, well, there's not anything else they can do. But also, I think there's a lack of ideas. I feel that every time I read what feel like increasingly identical think tank reports from all the kind of vaguely centre-left think tanks, or when I look at the IFS's pretend to be the Chancellor tax calculator and I can't increase inheritance tax above a certain amount and I can't. So I think there is an issue, and I think that the focus on one wealth tax, you're right, is not helping. That I think there are some well-intentioned... Two, where does the two come from? You've got one at best. But it's not enough. We still need to give them ideas, and we still, for the story to sound different to Farage's story, because he's happy to point the fingers at the blob and the establishment,
100%.
we have to talk about other
100%.
people. It's not all politicians' fault. And we vote for politicians, then is it also our fault vicariously?
So where what you say really resounds with me, Carys, is when you say there's a dearth of ideas in and around politics, especially on the left of politics. Yeah. I think it's a really tumbleweed kind of place right now. And it's shocking to me that nearly 20 years on from the banking crash, which was the crisis that everyone said should end neoliberalism and all the rest of it, should it usher in...
Bankers were to blame for that. We can't blame the bankers, can we? And the politicians.
And remember who saluted the bankers and allowed them to run the country. But it is amazing to me that it's the far right that's made the most capital out of the past 2 decades. And that says that something's gone really badly wrong in this country. I think if people are looking for genuine ideas in politics, and I know you've got a very well-read audience, I'd really recommend they go and look at the foundational economy work that's done. You can Google it and you'll find a whole bunch of their papers. But there is in particular a book called When Nothing Works, produced by the Foundational Economy Collective, which talks about this issue, about places such as the one in which I grew up, places like the one that Andy Burnham says he's trying to reach out to, places like the ones that are now voting for Nigel Farage, basically the places that were quote unquote left behind, to use an awful phrase, by globalization and by capital. And capital decided it had no need for these places anymore and for those people. And it's about, well, what do you do? What do you do when the growth is gone and you still have the people? How do you provide for them? What kind of economy should we be living in?
Okay, well, I think that's a nice note to end on, something for people to read and something that we can agree on. We need new and better ideas. Thank you for coming on, Aditya. I don't know what the final score is. People were
2-0,
saying,
but you remain hangry.
1-1 draw. People were saying maybe 2-1 to Carys. I don't
really
know. We'll let people write in with the answers. But am I hungry? No, I'm all right. There are snacks outside the studio and I know that I can access them. Thank you so much for coming on the show.